So in Tantra, it's all about complementarity. It's about the union of opposites. And so in the exhibition, we try to represent this very clearly, not just within individual objects, but the relationship between objects. So when we entered this room on Tantra, we were immediately engaged by this dancing female yogini. So what we see in this object here is sort of the male counterpart to that energetic, which was the Mahasiddha Virupa, in this beautiful 15th century statue that was created in the Chinese court, actually, in the 15th century, at a time when there was a deep unity between the Tantric Buddhist traditions in Tibet and in China. When we talk about the outer, inner, and secret ways in which Tantra Buddhism was explained, there's a very interesting story about this particular figure, Virupa. So, for example, how do we account for this large belly? Why do we account for what was originally in his right hand, which was a skull cup, a drinking cup, and actually his arm, which I'll talk about later, was originally pointing up towards the sun to stop it from going across the horizon. So in the outer story of Virupa, he was actually traveling and he reached a tavern where he was drinking. And the barmaid came up and said, you know, there's no more drinking when the sun sets, so this is kind of last call. And he said, he just put up his left arm, and we'll see that in an example in the murals itself, and stopped the sun in its tracks. The sun didn't go down across the horizon. He drank the tavern dry and never became intoxicated, and everyone converted to the Tantric Buddhist path. So this doesn't mean that he was just a kind of chronic alcoholic. What it actually represented on a symbolic inner level was the fact that anything could be integrated. Things that we might consider to be toxic or hazardous or poisonous, all of that can be absorbed and integrated into the Tantric Buddhist way of life. So that's sort of the inner meaning of this story, and the outer meaning, the innermost meaning is that he was pointing to the sun, which meant that he was stopping the flow of energy through his body and pointing to a source of perpetual illumination, which was the sun itself. So it's again how these objects, the aesthetics, represent incredible narratives that are in a way examples in our lives, whether you were a 15th century practitioner or you're a contemporary one. They somehow resonate with us. So the extraordinary aspects of the aesthetics on this particular object are really interesting to look at. First of all, it's fascinating to realize that this statue ended up in Japan and it had lost its left arm. And when it was conserved, it was put back into a form where it represented a Japanese temple guardian that would have been originally holding a kind of a staff. But actually in its original form, as we'll see in the murals themselves, he was pointing up to the sun. The other aspect when this object was conserved is that he had a meditation belt. We'll also see that it was holding up his left knee. We still see that around him, and yet when it was replaced and conserved, it's now become an ornamental object that goes around his belly, down into his groin, and it comes around his leg. But it's no longer actually serving the function that it did originally, which is symbolically to hold his leg into a kind of meditative pose to direct energy currents through the body in a particular way to bring about an altered state of awareness. So it's again an interesting way to see how the symbology that the object had in its origins has been somewhat transfigured by replacing his arm, and you can see even on his face he's almost as if he's quizzically looking at this prosthetic arm. And yet the figure remains this powerful ideal of being able to absorb everything. And here we see incredible details with the multiple layers of garlands around the body. This was the ornamentation of experience. This was the way that was a complete distinction from the monastic forms where you had to not only shave your hair on your head, you had to shave your eyebrows. It was a complete, you could say, trying to disembody, trying to disengage from the senses and sensory experiences, whereas what an object like Virupa here is showing us that the Tantric masters, it's about engaging them, but engaging them in different ways. So we can drink, but we never intoxicate it, and we can stop the sun in its tracks, whether we understand that to be something, an internal process, or in fact the universe itself. The complete realization through the meditative practices of Tantric yoga. There's a beautiful quotation from one of the earliest of the Mahasiddhas, Saraha, who said, "I have seen in my wanderings great temples and shrines, but I have not seen another one as blissful as my own body." So what we see in Virupa is almost a kind of example where the body itself is adorned the same way a temple might be. So we're seeing a transition from temple to a kind of template for an approach to life, a tantric template, if you will, for a way of being in which the body is not to be denigrated, not to be seen as some kind of impediment to spiritual life, but actually through its the richness and the elaboration, the body becomes the temple. And that's certainly at the very heart of the Tantric Buddhist tradition, is to revere the body, respect the body, bring it to its highest state of capacity and purity, and through that to recognize our true potential as human beings. And we see that so powerfully, as we'll see in the next room, with the whole idea of taking human bones and turning them into ornaments, turning them into aprons, making them objects of beauty, those which would in other contexts be objects of horror. So this is really the Tantric way. It's about rapture, it's about terror, but ultimately about self-transcendence. It's about not excluding anything from our range of experience, but bringing it all into a renewed and expansive state of being that's fearless, that's compassionate, that's luminous, open, and engaged with life in its deepest possible way.